those who matter do not mutter, and those who mutter do not matter. Here in BISNOMICS is where we discuss the true topics that really matters to the Sri Lankan business and economic landscape. I'm Gayani Ranasinghe. Welcome to your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. This is BISNOMICS. A fair workplace, a just workplace, a workplace where everyone is treated equally, a workplace free of harassment. Words that any employee would dream about and many employers gloat about. But in reality, how stark is the contrast? In Sri Lanka, do we really have a harassment-free workplace? And if not, as an organizational leader, what steps do you need to take? Let's discuss about that and more here in BISNOMICS. And joining me for this very insightful discussion is none other than Ms. Gayani Ranasinghe. Gayani, welcome to BISNOMICS. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tarind. It's nice to be here.
Gayani, let's first define the problem, because we hear so many words associated with this. We've seen global campaigns that in fact came like a wrecking ball towards many economies. The Me Too movement, the Me Too campaign. What exactly is harassment? Let's start with that.
Sure. So how does harassment really come into being at the workplace? I think that's important for us to understand. Each of us, we have our own very different educational, social, economic, etc. backgrounds. And whether we like it or not, our family, our individual beliefs, our community and social factors shape our beliefs, our perceptions, our attitudes. And when we are employed, we bring all of these beliefs, perceptions, attitudes to work, and we bring them to work every day. So when it comes to harassment, it's our individual beliefs of equality, inclusion, and violence that has an impact on harassment at work. So if I explain it a little bit further, we all as employees contribute to the culture of an organization. We have the capacity to influence it.
Culture as in the way of the organization, the way of life in the company.
Correct. So some people have more privilege or more influence on the culture than others. For example, leaders. People with leadership positions have the ability to influence the culture of an organization more than others. So if you have a leader who is respectful towards you, who is empathetic, who is a great communicator and gives you positive feedback, that is the behavior as a subordinate that you will emulate. On the other hand, if you have leaders who are abusive towards you, who use abusive language, who get very angry very fast and throw things at you, or you have bosses that give you tasks which are way below your skill set or way above your skill set. So these are the behavior you also try to role model. You emulate this. So this is why we say dynamics which are actually outside of the workplace. So these are individual beliefs and attitudes. They have an impact on the employee and they have an impact on the business performance. So this is where we can create a positive culture at work, or we also have the ability to create a very toxic work culture. So that is important to understand. When it comes to definitions, there's a general accepted global definition of harassment being unacceptable behaviors and unacceptable practices. It can be repetitive or it can also be like a single occurrence. And the aim of this unacceptable behavior and practices is to intimidate you, to humiliate you, and it causes physical, psychological and sexual intimidation. It offends you, it humiliates you. So that is really what we consider as harassment, unacceptable behavior and practices. So I can break this down further.
Please do. Because I think my next question is, maybe you could couple up with that. Is it always a case of physical harassment only, because we always hear the term sexual harassment. It gets spoken about, especially due to the Me Too campaign, and it's something that gets highlighted very often on various platforms. But research also shows there are so many other forms of harassment which can be equally damaging to an employee. So is it always about physical or sexual harassment, Gayani, or are there other forms of harassment as well?
So there are other forms of harassment, and one of the key things that's always overlooked is bullying. Right? Bullying has become normalized in our work cultures. So bullying is really about, it's repetitive and it happens over a period of time. So bullying behavior can be physical, it can also be verbal, it can also be psychological. So psychological means it's words and actions which we attempt to diminish your self-worth or your self-esteem. So examples would be when you go to your boss and or your supervisor and you say good morning, they completely ignore you, right? It's not that they are busy or anything, but they completely erase the existence of you. And when this keeps happening to you repeatedly, you really lose your self-confidence. You're not going to go up to that person and say good morning. You'd rather think like, maybe I would prefer not to say anything. So these are really bullying behaviors, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. They are verbal, psychological. So all of this is what we consider as bullying behavior. If when it comes to sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. So one of the key things that we have to understand is who decides whether this is unwelcome or not.
Very subjective.
Is it? So this is where the problem really begins, because many people think that the intent matters. What was my intention? Was my intention to cause you sexual harassment? Actually, the intent of the alleged perpetrator, what the witnesses perceive the incident to be, right, doesn't really matter. It's very simple. If you step back, whatever we do, Tarindu, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, depends on the impact.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's the same when it comes to harassment. What is the impact of the words you say? What is the impact of the behavior you do? So when it comes to sexual harassment, the impact on the recipient is what's key. So it's really not subjective, it's about how does that recipient feel. So if you say some positive comments, then obviously it is intended to create a positive work environment for you. But on the other hand, if I humiliate you and I name call you and I use abusive language, then really what is my impact? Is my impact to motivate you? Absolutely not. My impact is to demotivate you. So that is
to break you down.
To break you down. So that is what's important to understand. It's the impact on the recipient. It's the impact of bullying behavior on the recipient that is important for us to understand.
Now, when you look at this situation, Gayani, since you were referring to some of the workplace issues as well, innocent joke, borderline harassment versus a serious case of harassment, where do we draw the line? And even what you were mentioning earlier, unwelcome, because for example, sometimes we hear this very often, oh, look, you know what, this was happening, but I thought that person was okay with it. That's a signal I got. We hear these words happening, because I want to make it very clear here. We in no way would find it to be an acceptable way of behavior, but these are the confusions, because it's not something that is black and white in terms of being how it's defined and looked at in the outside world. The way I see it, there's a lot of gray areas in this, which we want to kind of demystify and clearly understand through this conversation what exactly can be done to avoid these things from happening. So like I said, an innocent joke, borderline harassment, serious case of harassment. Where does one draw the line?
So I think the intention matters, the impact matters as well. So when we are interacting with our peers, colleagues, supervisors, right, and we are cracking a joke, what's really important is not the feel you get by your own joke, that I cracked a great joke and I'm having a great time laughing at you, okay? But it's really about how does that joke make you feel. So we are really concentrating on the impact on the recipient, and that's what's important. And all these mixed signals that some person may get, I think you can really demystify it by very simply by asking the person, does it make you feel uncomfortable? And if they say yes, please don't crack jokes about my weight, about my appearance, about what I'm wearing, then you get the message. But the issue is, do we really listen to that?
Gayani, before that, do we really ask that question is a matter, isn't it?
Yes. So that is exactly where you can demystify it. So if you are unsure as to what you said was taken well or not, why not take the initiative and ask, when I made that joke, did it make you feel uncomfortable? That really gives you a compass, a guide to your own behavior. Why wait till others point fingers at you, Tarindu? After all, we are all adults. We are responsible for our words and our actions. So there's a way in which you can always get feedback from people. Or if you are embarrassed to ask that person directly, maybe you can ask from your colleagues and say, what do you think? What do you think happened when I, behaved like that? So those are some important steps to really look at yourself, your own behavior.
Gayani, do you think this problem starts way before corporate careers begin from the school level? Do you think at a Sri Lankan school level, we are doing enough to prevent bullying? Because from what I see between some of the Western countries and their education system, they've gone to a level where they sometimes have officers in charge of looking into cases of bullying and discrimination. Whereas in a Sri Lankan context, to a large extent, it just gets kind of swept under the carpet. Oh, there's a famous saying, boys will be boys.
Correct.
That's it. Let them hit each other, let them do that. Oh, that's how boys are. And then we tell the boys also, we tell the young boys of today, that's how boys are supposed to be. You're not supposed to cry, you're supposed to just take it up and you're supposed to fight back, etc. Whereas, no, it's not okay to fight, it's not okay to do that. That message, I don't think gets clearly communicated at a school level. And then even at a girls' school level, I mean, for young girls who are schooling, I believe this issue of bullying, harassment is happening even in schools where it's only female students. Do you think the problem starts from the school system?
I think the problem really starts from home. That is where the problem really starts, because as I told you, our individual beliefs, our individual perceptions, our attitudes, our learned behavior is really what guides us through our journey in life. And when it comes to our home front, if we are exposed to a lot of violence in our own home, and if our parents, the way they talk, they use abusive language and they bully each other, they have various methods of intimidating each other, threatening each other, right? This is normal for us. This is life for us. And we take this learned behavior, because remember, when you're kids, you're like a sponge, you absorb everything. And this is your learned behavior. And you take this to school. And in your interactions, monkey see, monkey do, right? So you emulate it. So when you're angry with someone, you will, dash things to the ground, because this is the behavior you were taught. So yes, you're right to say that in the school system, these are not taught. But this is why we always say these are dynamics which are outside of the workplace that impacts people at work. So it is actually our individual beliefs, and we really need to start young in teaching people what is acceptable behavior. How do you interact with people? How do you interact with other genders, not just male and female, with lesbians, gay, transsexuals, right? How do you interact? How do you not speak to them with respect? So these are some things that we really need to take into account. I think I can give you a very simple example. There was a study done by the UNFPA, actually it's a survey done in 2017, and it was about the prevalence of sexual harassment in the public transport. What do you think the numbers were?
I'm assuming it would have been pretty scary.
It was very scary. And this is sexual harassment in a public setting, right?
When everyone is watching.
When everyone's watching, of girls and women was around 90%.
That's serious.
So this is Sri Lanka for you. And the best part is, it's a public setting, nobody is attempting to intervene. we do not have that moral compass to intervene and to say, look, what are you doing? This is a schoolgirl, or what kind of behavior is this that's happening? So this is really where the problem is for Sri Lanka, that one, people don't seem to understand what is acceptable behavior. Some have become normalized. This is the way, as you said, this is the way we behave. And the other is nobody intervenes, nobody supports. So this is really the problem.
How serious is this sexual harassment problem in Sri Lankan workplaces, and what is the economic impact of it? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus today is regarding workplace harassment. What can be done to avoid it, and what are the bigger root causes behind this very serious issue in our organizations? And joining me for this discussion is Gayani Ranasinghe. Gayani, referring to what you mentioned earlier, that nobody intervenes, I also want to share an experience with you, what I've seen. So this was a few years back. School has just been finished. There was a school bus of a leading boys' school going down R.A.D. Milmouth, the duplication road. And there was one lonely girl standing near a particular shop, probably waiting to be picked up. And that entire bus was saying so many abusive things to her. Now, I was there, but there was also a policeman. And that policeman seemed to be doing nothing about it. But a few days later, I ended up asking my question, why didn't I intervene? So as you said, it's probably a social thing. We are all in that mindset, look, nobody's intervening, nobody's saying anything. Maybe it's okay, it's just some innocent fun. But so I didn't feel right for having stood silent. I'm just now sharing this with you very openly. And I personally think I should have said something on that day. And I think, as you very correctly said, when the adults are behaving, the boys and the girls are watching. And the young boys and the girls of today are the men and women of tomorrow. Correct. So I think, as you very correctly said, it's a good point. Starting from the homes, we need to start setting an example and showing that this is not right, this is not acceptable. I want to bring in a different dimension to this discussion. When we talk about sexual harassment, is it something only females are facing, or do we see this issue being faced by men as well?
Right. So if you take harassment broadly, that includes sexual harassment. So Sri Lanka doesn't have a lot of data nationwide. So in the absence of, apart from the UNFPA data which I shared with you, Sri Lanka has very little data on these because there are not many people who've done surveys. But if you look at global statistics, and if you look somewhere that's a little closer to Sri Lanka, like Myanmar, where the IFC did a study in 2019, what it really said was that men are more likely to get bullied than sexually harassed. And the most prevalent type of harassment at the workplace is actually bullying, but we don't really talk about it. So in Myanmar, what the statistics were was that 40% felt that they have been bullied at work. That's a staggering number, 40% of your employees. And 56% have seen it happen to someone else, right? So this is about bullying. So generally, men are more prone to get bullied at work. That's what the statistics indicate. When it comes to sexual harassment, women face sexual harassment more than men. It is not to say that men don't, but it's also important to remember the power dynamics, the power relations. So in most of the corporate world, it's the men who are in the senior positions, right? So with that, sexual harassment also has a different ratios when it comes to males and females. When it comes to the females, 15% of them have experienced sexual harassment, and 21% have seen it happen to someone else.
Or they are aware that it's happening to somebody.
They've seen it.
They've seen it.
So you always know that it always happens in a public setting. So those really are the numbers when it comes to harassment. So bullying is more prevalent for men, while sexual harassment is more prevalent for women. But I really want us to see this as not a female issue, not a male issue. Don't attach a gender to it, but rather see it as a workplace productive issue. a workplace productivity issue. And the stats also say that there is a 14% annual labor productivity loss due to harassment. Due to, that means bullying, due to sexual harassment. So it's really about, it affects all genders. Though we have a tendency only to concentrate on sexual harassment, what is most prevalent is bullying. And this really does cause a big labor productivity loss annually.
And when we talk about the economic impact now, research shows that globally, out of about a 2.7 billion workforce of women, they say more than 2 billion women globally have actually faced some sort of harassment. From a female perspective, Gayani, I know, as you said, it's a workplace issue, not a gender issue, but how really does it affect them? It starts to affect their work, their mindset, because you work with people who have faced similar issues, you are counseling them, you are guiding them. What do they really go through after these experiences, and what kind of an impact does it have on their performance mindset?
So one of the biggest issues when it comes to sexual harassment is stigma. How does this stigma come? Stigma really comes from a very negative response that can come from either your management, that means from the workplace you can get stigmatized, or from the community. I'll break this down for you, right? So let's say there's a sexual harassment incident and a female goes and complains. Then if you have a leadership team that is honestly interested in knowing what happened and addressing it, you are very fortunate. But sometimes the stigma comes from a very wrong reaction from the leadership, because there's always a tendency to associate blame for the person who has been harassed. So questions like, what were you wearing, come to being. What was your part in it? So these are all wrong attitudes towards sexual harassment. Without unpacking and understanding the incident, you have already prejudged this and said that it is something to do with the way the complainant was dressed or behaving.
Which I personally think is irrelevant.
It's completely irrelevant, right? And also what's important is gossip starts spreading at office. So and so has complained about sexual harassment. And they start talking about you. They start digging up everything of your past, which is probably not even relevant to this particular incident that has happened, right? So there's also the fear of you may cause someone to lose their job, or will I lose my job? Will I be transferred? So all of these causes stigma. So really people don't want to come forward with this kind of stigma. They'd rather bear with it, and if they really can't, they'd leave the organization, right? The other stigma comes from the community, right? So that is where your friends, your colleagues will get to social media, pick out all your, Facebook pictures or whatever in social media, and, post pictures about, look how she's dressed, look, she's having a drink, right? So suddenly everything that's
chatting on WhatsApp about this.
Yes. So suddenly everything that is not relevant comes to the limelight. And this has a serious impact on your family. So if, you don't want your family dragged into this as well, and when things get onto social media, it takes a life of its own, Tarindu. And suddenly it is not an incident at the workplace. This has now become like a big, talking, a big gossiping session on social media. So it's really this stigma that really prevents people from coming forward. And it's not to say that it's not prevalent, it is very prevalent, but it's the stigma that doesn't enable you to come forward. And also, what really are your legal rights when it comes to these things? That also has a accessibility is also.
A lot of people don't know. They think this is how things happen in the organization. And some of them think that, look, you know what, it's something happening inside a company. Maybe there is no legal protection for me, but that's not the case.
That is not the case. But at the same time, there's a lot that the employer can do. So I won't go into the details of what the employer can do. I'll park it for now. But I think in terms of the legal standpoint for you is that in sexual harassment, sexual annoyance, is a criminal offence under the Penal Code of Sri Lanka. So the Penal Code was amended in 1995, and under section 345, they defined sexual harassment, and in the explanation they also further defined sexual harassment at the workplace. But when it's a criminal offence, what is expected is that complainant to go to the police station, make a complaint, and you have to prove this beyond reasonable doubt. So it's the police who will institute action against the alleged perpetrator.
And what kind of situations do our ladies face when they go to the police station to talk about this? My question is, not to put the great services done by the Sri Lanka Police Department down, but Gayani, is there a conducive enough environment for a female to openly, confidently go to the police and take up a matter like this? What is your experience?
I think the answer is no. And numbers show you that. People are not going and reporting, because also remember it's a criminal offence. So the burden of proof is also higher at court. It's beyond reasonable doubt. And when this incident has happened at the workplace, there is no way in which the employer is held accountable. So this is against you, which the police will litigate on behalf of you, and the alleged perpetrator. So it really becomes like a matter between these two, as opposed to the employer also playing a role. So there is no way in which the employee can hold the company accountable for the behavior that happened. Because remember, at the end of the day, if you are an employer, you are responsible for the health and safety of
the well-being of your employees.
Of your employees, right? So where do we really give accountability for the employer? So, I mean, you might argue and say, why not go under industrial disputes and, go to the Commissioner General of Labour. And
easier said than done.
It's easier said than done, right? And statistics will also show you that not a single person has purely gone for a purpose of harassment and harassment alone at the workplace. They have gone for union victimization and coupled it with bullying, but not for harassment and harassment alone. The other is, your only option is constructive termination, where you had to resign because the employer was not taking action. But why not have remedies where, whilst we are still in employment, we have the opportunity to address it? Why is it that your employment must be severed or terminated for you to really hold the employer accountable? So those are the gaps that we have, and it is these gaps also which prevent people from coming forward.
Gayani, I understand this is a very sensitive topic. In fact, a topic which we don't always see being openly discussed as well, probably because of the sensitive and controversial nature. But the whole purpose of our discussion is also to make sure that the young girls, the young female employees, or for that matter, any, regardless of the age, female employees are becoming further aware of this and knowing that there is steps that is possible to be taken. So I really do appreciate you sharing these thoughts. Gayani, if you look at most of these sexual harassment cases, the origins might have been a passing hint or a comment or maybe a tap. And then we hear cases where employees say, look, sometimes they started making very vulgar comments about how I dress. And then when I was not responding to those hints and the advances being made, I was sometimes transferred on on certain long distance projects. I was put into very difficult working circumstances and environments. Now, you probably see this happening way more than we do. Gayani, what are the symptoms and what do you see? Give us an overall idea about what really women who are facing these sexual harassments, where it starts and what they are going through when they don't kind of respond to some of these advances. Because I believe there is a majority of female employees who are silently suffering from this problem, and we want them to know, if you're watching this, we want you to know that you're not alone in this, that you can take measures and take the fight. Gayani, share with us some insights on this.
Right. So the example that you gave, it's a classic case of quid pro quo. That's a Latin phrase that simply means
quid pro quo.
It simply means this for that. Okay, so this is inappropriate use of power. So this is where some form of conditions are put on you in exchange for a sexual favor or a behavior. So the example that you spoke of, like maybe you're awaiting a promotion, you're awaiting an increment, a transfer, learning opportunities.
And Gayani, sorry to interrupt, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is not a problem that the instance that I said, it's not a situation only in blue collar laborers, even some very white collar, esteemed, prestigious
Correct.
white collar organizations are having similar practices.
Of course, of course. And this is what we say as inappropriate use of power. So it's made conditional upon you perform me a sexual favor, I'll give you your promotion, give you your increment, right? So this is really where power is being misused. So persons of power. The other is a hostile working environment. So this is where there is no exchange of anything, but rather an environment which makes you feel intimidated and offended. So when it comes to these kind of behaviors, I think one of the key things is what really are the methods of addressing it in your respective office. I think if you are an employee, regardless of your gender, right, it's important to ask, how do we report harassment? And really lobby for change within your organization. I mean, we can always wait for the employer to change, but we also can make small suggestions for the employer to have a policy on harassment in a total form, not just concentrating on sexual harassment, but harassment overall in the workplace. And these policies are then going to drive you towards the next step. The policy is always the start, Tarindu. So you can have ways of a policy describing what is acceptable behavior and what is not. Then how do you report it? Can I self-report? What are my methods of self-reporting? Who are the leaders that we can go to? And these leadership should have a diverse representation, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of ethnicity and also in terms of their levels in the organization. So that way the complainant can pick and choose who am I more comfortable with to go and talk about this. Because these are very sensitive topics.
Extremely sensitive.
Yes, and you're not open to go and speak to anybody.
For sure.
Right? So you must have a panel where employees can select who do they go and speak to. So sometimes when you go and speak to and you get a disclosure as a leader, some are really asking the behavior to stop. It's as simple as that. Or some are asking for a more formal investigation process. So this is really where we need to help our employees, because remember, this is learned behavior which is replicated at work. So how do we help our employees to understand that XYZ type behavior that you did, the incident that happened, is not accepted here, and we need you to change these behaviors.
For sure.
Right? You can consider this as your first warning. If it repeats, we will be taking disciplinary action. So that has to come forward.
The system has to be there coming in. I understand that point. Some very good thoughts there. Gayani, we are going to come back to you more on that. Stay tuned. We will be back after this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and today we are speaking about the extremely sensitive topic of harassment in the workplace. What's it about and what needs to be done to make sure it doesn't happen in your organization? And we are in conversation with an expert on this topic, Gayani Ranasinghe. Gayani, now as a leader of an organization, for any leader of an organization, a CEO, head of HR, it could be any leader or even a team leader of an organization who is watching this show right now and thinking, how can I prevent sexual harassment in my organization, and what are the signs that maybe without me realizing, maybe the CEO is not realizing this, but what would be the signs that, look, that employee is probably facing some kind of harassment, maybe sexual, maybe verbal. What are the signs that things are not that great in paradise?
Right. So I think one of the key things, one of the most important things that you should really do, be it a team leader or a leader, right, is first and foremost, always understand that bullying or harassment, even sexual harassment, always happens in a public setting, the first instance. The first occurrence is always in a public setting. So sometimes the complainant may not be willing to come forward, but you have so many people looking on. How do we empower these looking on people to contribute? That is a key. So the classic thing is when you
Because
see
they are passively supporting it, isn't it, by
yes.
doing that?
So I'll give you 4 types of employees that we have at work, right? So we have the classic case of I saw nothing, I heard nothing. Okay? We don't want people like that because they are, as you said, are passively supporting. Then you have spectators, and I use that word very meaningfully. You know, when we are a spectator watching something, you know our behavior, right? We clap, we encourage, we egg on. So we also don't want people to be spectators who are watching a harassment incident. We don't want them to behave in a way where that unacceptable behavior is encouraged to happen. The third type is what we are really trying to get at, that is observers. This is where employees are trying to really understand what's the behavior that's happening. And you can ask them 2 questions. Would you like it if that behavior happened to you? Would you like it if that behavior happened to your loved one? And that is really going to give you the solution. Then you can convert these observers to the next batch of our employees, and this is the space that we want them to be actively engaging in intervening. So when an incident is happening, what we want is our employees to intervene, not to intervene in an aggressive way, like and cause even more for the problem to escalate, but rather intervene in a way that changes the conversation. So if we are focusing on someone and we are bullying a particular person or a group of people, we move the conversation away. And in this kind of situation, once the incident is over, there's a way in which they can go and report back saying this incident happened. And as I've understood from most of the surveys that we've done, is that most of the time you witness bullying happening by your own peer. So you really have the capacity to talk to that person, to influence this. Yes, what the hell were you doing? Stop doing that, right? You have that ability. So this is one of the first steps. So, but to get your employees to do this, you need to train them. You need to first make them understand what is acceptable behavior, and then give them the tools to help them to intervene as a bystander, as a person who's looking on. And that is one of the key things for leaders to do, because remember, this is learned behavior, dynamics outside of the organization coming in. So for people to change their culture, for people to change their thinking, it takes time. So it takes one conversation at a time, one good decision at a time to change this toxic culture in our organization.
But the conversations have to start happening soon.
Yes. And for that end, we really need to do concise, simple trainings.
Gayani, we always hear so much of talk about the people being the greatest asset of a country. And even in Sri Lanka, there's so much talk about increasing the productivity, getting more from the workforce, etc., etc. But as a country, do we have a proper policy to address this issue of harassment? And what about the legal implications? Are there any laws or, let's say, new laws which are coming in that are addressing this critical issue?
I'm happy you asked this, Tharindu, because right now Sri Lanka is studying to ratify a UN convention, and it's called Elimination of Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. So this is a UN treaty which came into being in 2019. So Sri Lanka is still studying this. But this treaty is really important because for the first time we are getting uniform terminology, right? Because we've had various definitions, but this is bringing in uniform terminology. But let's just say that's academics and get that out of the way, right? The other most important thing is this treaty really recognizes that there are certain vulnerable groups in our communities that are more prone for harassment, and they have identified women as one of those groups, and that it prevents women from accessing, remaining, and even progressing in the labor market. Right? So when you talk about productivity and you want the women workforce to participate, and in Sri Lanka the female labor market is at 36%, so that's very low.
Correct.
And you also
despite most of our graduates actually being females.
Correct.
So we have a problem in the fundamental labor structure in this country.
Correct. Right. So why is it that they are not participating? Right. One aspect could be harassment, but of course there are other dynamics to it. Right. So this treaty is important for Sri Lanka, and it also talks about the world of work, not just workplace. So generally we always think of work meaning where I am an employee and I am a worker, and that is the world of work. But this treaty expands it, and it talks about the informal sector. So despite your contractual status, you can be an employee, an intern, a job seeker, a job applicant, apprentice, or a person selling fruits as a vendor. Any of those are in the world of work. So it covers everybody. Right? That is important. So this treaty also addresses domestic workers. So as you know, domestic workers in Sri Lanka are not even governed by the minimum wage. They have no social security, no EPF, nothing for them. So when it comes to the world of work, they are also made part of it, which is a very progressive step and a much needed step. Similarly, even migrant workers. So Sri Lanka has a lot of migrant labor currently, and it's important that they too are protected. So this treaty has a very broad brush, and this broad brush helps us to ensure that anybody engaged in the world of work is free from violence and harassment. So Sri Lanka has a lot to do in terms of its laws, and there have been studies done specifically by Gayani Ranasinghe, who has done a really in-depth study on the gaps in the Sri Lankan law and what needs to be done. Because it's just not a simple, going and quickly ratifying it, but it's about how do we make it practically happen. And this convention has also to be read together with R206, which is a set of recommendations. And that is important because the recommendations really tells the kinds of policies, procedures, practical steps that the government should adopt, that employers should adopt, and also workers' organizations.
So, Gayani, if you could quickly, before we wind up, mention a few steps that an employee who may be facing this right now, this issue at work, what are the support systems available for them? What can they really do about it? If you could just quickly take a minute or two and just touch upon that.
Sure. So I think the first step is please don't remain silent. It is important that you raise it to your leadership. Yes, you may face some repercussions, but keeping quiet about it doesn't mean that this behavior is going to go. We need to have a cultural shift. So pick the leader that you feel is you are most comfortable to go and report these issues. Right? It's when people go and push the leadership that the company is also forced to change, forced to address, and that is important. When you talk about support networks, you can always reach out to women in media. They are also doing various webinars and sessions to educate people. Also, Diversity Collective Lanka, they are also one of those groups that you could reach out to, and also the Grassrooted Trust. So those are some of the organizations that you can reach out to if you are having an issue.
Gayani, I know this is a very sensitive topic, but you laid it out all there for us. You explained what is harassment, you explained what needs to be done about it. Thank you for all the encouragement that you gave to the audience today with your insight and experience, and good luck to you with all the future endeavors, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Tarindu, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this important topic, and all the very best to you too.
Thank you very much. The pleasure was ours to have you. The young boys and girls who are watching what's happening, starting from their homes of today, are the men and women of tomorrow. Let's start setting a better example. And in your workplace, if harassment is taking place, don't be a spectator. Be the one that intervenes and puts an end to it. Because creating better workplaces in Sri Lanka begins with us. And it begins by us taking action and raising the voice when something right is not happening. And no matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead and stay safe.